and kick things off. Again, want to introduce ourselves before we dive too far into the session itself, but we appreciate everyone joining us here for today's session on strategic planning framework best practices. As I shared earlier, my name is Busch. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Elate, and I'm joined by Jacey. And Jacey, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacey Liechty. I'm our Senior Director of Customer Solutions over here at Elate. So I get to work with our customers day in and day out as we think about frameworks, talking about those, thinking about best practices, how we bring those to life. So really excited for the conversation today, where we'll be walking through some of these things, as well as starting to go through some of the questions that you all put through chat to make this really geared towards your needs as much as possible. So excited for the conversation.
Yeah, and just to give a little bit of context here as we dive into it. So this is our Blueprint Live series, and this is going to be the first of a 4-part series that was really born out of feedback that we received from guests and attendees of Blueprint, which was our live in-person event that we held here in Indianapolis in mid-August. And one of the things that we just heard time and time again was that the breakout sessions we held with customers, prospects, just strategy and operations leaders themselves were incredibly valuable. Frankly, to the extent where we didn't have enough time allocated for those breakout sessions, and we saw those just carry over throughout the day into happy hour and networking events into the evening. And so we got a lot of feedback from surveys and questions that had gone out of, can we revisit some of those areas that we just started to scratch the surface on in person? And it led to what we're bringing together today, which is Blueprint Live, where we're trying to make this something that's available to folks that didn't make the trip to Indianapolis and those that did, that want to continue on in that conversation. And so for today, where we wanted to start, especially as we're in the fall and we're thinking about 2025 strategic planning, is overall best practices for strategic planning frameworks. We see a lot of different strategies, a lot of different frameworks that are brought to life through organizations. And ahead of today's session, we sent out 3 questions just to prompt the discussion. What have you seen work well for your organization? What have you maybe not seen work so well? And what are you focused on as we go into the next fiscal year and getting right within the strategic planning framework? Overall, if I just kind of encompass the first 2 buckets, which is what have we seen work well, almost resoundingly what we got back was simplicity. So keeping things simple is just a tried and true way to make sure you get that buy-in, you get that alignment from the onset. I would say the other one that we saw was clear communication. And we'll touch on a few of those here as we go throughout the presentation. In terms of what didn't go so well, one of the key areas was transparency. Folks didn't actually know what the strategy was, what we were trying to achieve as an organization. And then too many cooks in the kitchen. We had too many hands trying to bring this together, and then everyone goes off and does their own thing. And we try to bring those individual meals back, and we have a hodgepodge of different dishes rather than something that was cohesively put together for the dinner itself. And so as we think about those 2 areas and how that ties into where our focus is for next fiscal year, a lot of the sentiment, a lot of the feedback that we simply got was around that idea of how do we build a more cohesive plan, one where we have collaboration, where we have the communication that's being driven from individuals, not just having a say in the overall strategy, but then how is that carried through in the communication and the collaboration of building it from tops down as well as bottoms up type of approach within the strategic planning process. So that's where, from our end, we want to make sure we take the conversation today is orienting around where we want to go for next year. Again, this is designed as more of a Q&A. So we had some questions come in advance, but I would strongly encourage folks that as we go through this, we're going to be pausing and taking a step back to kind of calibrate where the question's coming from, where are the areas we might want to double click on throughout today's presentation. So I encourage everyone to please drop in those chats. We'll try to get to every single one that comes through, as well as those questions that were sent in advance. So all that being said, we come here today and we have this idea around, okay, what is strategic planning? What does that entail? What are those frameworks and best practices? But before we even get into those best practices, where I want to make sure we start the conversation is really behind the why. Why does this even matter? Why is a framework something that we want to instill within our organization? And for us, we kind of start with three areas and how we want to think about strategic planning. The first of which is connection. How do we bring together where we want to go, or that long-term vision itself, with how we get there, or tactical execution? For us, that is really the intent behind why we built Elate in the first place, why we are so passionate about solving this challenge for strategy and operations leaders, is bringing together that idea of vision and execution. In doing so, the second leg of this stool is consistency. How do we ensure that as we go about bringing together where we're going and how we get there, we're creating that sense of consistency and driving language across our teams, driving clarity, as we'll get into here momentarily, but overall making sure that we know what is our operating rhythm, our cadence, how we're reporting on our strategy, how we're building that and transitioning quarter over quarter, so that there are no surprises or gotchas as we move into the thick of things, as we actually go into executing our strategy in 2025 and beyond. And then, as I mentioned already, clarity. How do we provide that sense of direction to allow employees to connect on a deeper level with the strategy, with the purpose behind what we're all setting out to achieve on a daily basis within the organizations that we work towards? We talk about this a lot. There is a deep need and desire at a human level of folks to feel connection, to feel as though what they're working on has meaning and value, and that they're part of a larger picture than just what is it that I'm focused on in my own island. And so that idea of clarity really is aimed at driving autonomy through clarity, through giving visibility into what we're focused on, what we're trying to achieve together. And so these are the three things that we really focus on in saying, why does a framework matter? Building one that is connected, creating that consistency in how we review, how we report, how we come back to the plan itself, and then giving clarity to team members and employees themselves. And so this is a bit about the why. We want to start here before we get into the actual framework, because this, again, sets the stage for where we want to go throughout the entirety of today's conversation. But with that being said, Jacey, I'll kind of turn things over to you now to start to think about, or at least high level, go through that structure that we see work really well within a lot of organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to start to dive into this. We'll spend a good amount of time here as we start to go through the framework itself. So as we think about your framework, I know this can look different across different organizations. You might use different acronyms. You might use different language and vocabulary across your organization. But at the end of the day, the reason that we are building a really strong framework goes back to the three pieces that Brooks just mentioned. We want to make sure we take that long-term vision, who we are as an organization, where we're going, all the way down to how we are going to get there, to ensure that as we're creating all of these objectives, we're all doing so in a way that is connected. So as we start to ask that question of where are we going and how do I fit in, employees have that feeling. They know where we're going. They know how they're a part of that plan as we start to put all this together. So what we're going to do is go through the different layers of the framework that you see here on the screen. We will define each of those layers. We will pause and give some examples for those as well as we're building those out, but also share best practices along the way. So share things that we've seen with organizations that we've worked with, things that we maybe want to avoid as we're stepping into planning season, and things that we want to maybe encourage people to continue building into their framework as we think about rolling that out across their organization. So I know we've mentioned this a couple times now, but as we're going through, please, I know this isn't a webinar format, but we want to make this as conversational as we can with the Q&A. So as we're going through the different layers, please use the chat to have any thoughts that pop up, add those in there. We're going to be monitoring that so that we can pause and answer any of these as we go through as well for what this looks like for your organization. All right. So without further ado, let's start to go through the different phases of these and what this starts to look like. So we're actually going to start on the left-hand side of the screen here with that teal bucket, the mission, vision, and values. Of course, this piece is critical and so incredibly important as we think about who we are as an organization, what matters, and where we want to go long-term. We're actually speaking with someone this morning who started to talk about the mission as like that candle that's always burning. And I loved that, right? We want to start to think about, great, when we rally around this plan, we first want to reorient and kind of have our employees start to think about that larger picture. So as we go through these, again, these are oftentimes set by the CEO or the visionary leaders, where we say, great, the top one, this is our mission. This is why we do what we do here at our organization. Oftentimes we're not seeing this change often, but we want to come back to it to make sure we're continuing to recalibrate and know why that's important. Now, that second piece here is where we start to unpack that vision of, great, where do we want to go long term as we think about where we want to be as an organization? Oftentimes, these are set maybe at that 1, 3, 5-year vision. So really thinking long term that everyone can anchor and rally around of, this is where we want to be as we think about that upcoming timeframe. And then the third and final piece here, something I don't want to gloss over, because our values are really, really important. And for a lot of those might be hanging up on our wall, things that we're coming back to time and time again. But as we think about our framework and building out the plan, those are things that we do not want to lose sight of. Because as we start to build out all of these objectives and the goals that we want to hit, everything we do, of course, comes back and should be in service of the way that we operate as an organization, the way we work with our partners and other companies as well. So as we think about this, we don't want to forget that really important step. I would say when you are going to roll this out to your company, rather than going straight to, hey, here's the strategy that we have set for the year and how we're going to get there, we always want to reorient our team members back to who we are as an organization and where we're going. That can really start to bring this framework to life on the right-hand side. All right. So let's now shift to the different layers that stack upon each other, the different kind of Lego building blocks that we have here on the right-hand side to start to put this strategy together. So the very top one that we have here are the operational metrics. So as we think about these operational metrics, these are really a handful of quantitative measurements and KPIs that really allow us to understand how our company's operations are performing. Now, for all of you on the call today, these are going to look a little different for your teams, but we see things, of course, like revenue growth, gross profit margin, employee turnover rate, different measurements and metrics that we're going to be looking at to ultimately allow us to measure the performance of our business. For the example that we have today, we're going to take the revenue one because, of course, this is one of the most common examples that we see in an operational metric. But let's say for this example on the screen, one of these metrics is going to be that we want to get to $30 million in recurring revenue by the end of the year. Again, as you can see, this allows not only us to measure the performance of the business, but these are also numbers that we are reporting out to our board. So for those of you on the call that know what that feels like to start to put together a lot of these quarterly board reports, these are things that you are likely putting in the very first slides as we are going through this. These numbers matter a lot. It is really, really important that we anchor to these and we can rally around them. We also want to make sure that they are not disconnected. Time and time again, I think we start to see that our operational metrics are in one swim lane and our strategy is in another. And we want to make sure that those are really cohesive and we're bringing them together, which we'll talk about here in a moment with the different layers. But this isn't something that we can put all the operational metrics on a screen and just say, hey team, this is where we want to get to. Good luck, let's go get it. The layers below are what's going to help us provide that clarity, that direction for how we're going to tackle it and how we're going to get there. Brooks, I'm going to pause here. I know we've had a lot of things and questions come up in the past about operational metrics. Anything you would add there before we start to add in the layers below?
Yeah, so this is, I think without question, one of the easiest things to overlook or gaps that exist when creating a strategy is that disconnect between an operating plan and then the strategy that itself is not necessarily connected to that operating plan, which it should be always. An operating plan in the form of a pro forma and an Excel spreadsheet and something that's being managed and reported to on the board, while it might seem as though that lives in finance or lives on its own, it is what oftentimes necessitates or dictates how the strategy is built to begin with. And we want to make sure we're capturing that within this framework. Ultimately, that's how not only the executive team, but more importantly, the CEO is held accountable is, are we delivering on these operating metrics or not? If the answer is no, then everything else below this probably needs to be reoriented in a way that does point towards or allows us to deliver on those operating metrics themselves. We've had a few questions come in here from the chat. The first of which was, how would operational metrics fit into the Elate structure as we are using the platform to plan? How are they different than outcomes? So the operating metrics, where we see those typically nested within how we think about things in Elate, is on the company page, and specifically on the scorecard. So we have a company page that is your mission, your vision, your themes, your values, and then a scorecard that is indicative of what are those, let's call it 3 to 5 operating metrics that are just the guiding principles for how we build the strategy and what we need to make sure the outcomes themselves orient towards within our strategy, within our plan. We have another question here. How are these naming conventions, and are these used internally, or do others on the call use these as well? These are what we have set as kind of the nomenclature within Elate. I will say that certain parts of this framework or structure, they might change based on the organization. I think structurally, we want to make sure that this is in place. But as an example, we very often see that themes for a lot of organizations are referred to as pillars, or objectives might be referred to as initiatives. The most important thing is that once you have kind of quote unquote hard coded in this vernacular, you stick with it. This taxonomy or this language itself is really important to building buy-in and consensus within an organization. The last thing we want is this language to change anytime your CEO or the exec team reads a new strategic planning book and changes from EOS to OKRs, 40X, because that's going to cause a lot of whiplash and a lot of confusion within organizations. And so we very much orient around, once we have set this language, as we'll speak to here in a bit, we want to lock it in, so to speak. So I know there are a few questions that came in that I wanted to make sure we touched on before we dove any deeper.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooks. Yes, these are great questions, and great point as we think about the language and the vernacular that we use through these as well. That actually takes us right to the next layer, which are those themes. And you're probably going to see me sit up a little taller or get excited around this one, because if I had to pick a favorite part of the framework, this is it. Themes really are that glue. It's the connective tissue where we start to build that golden thread between, hey, this is where we're going, that long-term vision, these operational metrics that we want to achieve at the end of the year. And they start to really build that common language for everyone across the organization of, how are we going to get there? How are we going to start executing on what we want to do? Now, before I start going into the examples here, I will say that oftentimes as humans, there is a very natural instinct to go straight to the green level and straight to building all the objectives or the initiatives. I've been very guilty of that as well, even as I think about building New Year's resolutions. You want to start just building this entire list of everything that you want to do and everything that you want to tackle. But what happens when we just jump right down to the objective level is we start to run into this laundry list of all the things that we want to do. And it becomes really, really hard and difficult to avoid this list that is difficult to also effectively prioritize as well, because we haven't given it that meaning yet, or those categories of work. So as we think about themes, oftentimes people might refer to these as pillars, rallying cries, strategic priorities. For us, we do use the word themes here internally. And I like to think of these as categories or buckets of the top priorities that are really intentional. They're really directional in the way that they're written, and they give meaning to the work that we are about to take on. So I will say for organizations, we typically see around 3 to 5 themes. We do want to make sure that we are keeping those really concise rather than going too broad where we're focusing on everything. But we'll typically start to see ones in the realm of revenue growth, maybe a different product or service that we're taking to market, and typically one around culture as well that we'll start to bucket into these different themes. Now, for the example on the screen today, we're going to follow the example as we had the $30 million recurring revenue for the operational metrics. The theme, again, it's written in a way that's directional, it's intentional, that says, well, how are we going to get there? We want to make sure that we are driving indispensability to operations leaders. So again, what you can see immediately is now this creates this common language of what we're doing, why we're doing it. This becomes a guidepost and a guiding light for all of our employees as we begin creating that plan and saying, what initiatives and goals do I want to take on? Well, what's going to allow us to drive indispensability to operations leaders? We can ask ourselves that question at the beginning when we start to put our plan together. And as we start to have 3 or 5 themes, now when we're building this plan, we will see in that annual planning phase how our work is starting to be distributed across our different themes. A lot of times we'll see that one theme might hold a lot, and then we have one team or one theme, which we refer to as a one team theme over here. Oftentimes that sometimes ends up being the culture theme, where there's one team or one objective holding it up. So the themes allow us to really have those conversations to say, is this important as we thought it was? Is this distributed across our workforce? And how are we going to get there and make sure we're all rowing in the same way together? The final thing that I'll add about themes here, and I see a lot of different chats come through here, so we can pause, but not only is this a great activity in the beginning, as we begin to build out that list and those objectives of the things that we're going to achieve, more importantly, these themes could and should become that guidepost when we are a quarter in to our plan. And inevitably, what's going to happen is all these fires are going to come up. We're going to have unforeseen priorities after we get off of a call and want to start going different directions. So when we're planning quarter over quarter, when we're refreshing our plan, this allows us to come back to those themes and say, hey, is this still where we are going? Is this going to help us get there? And again, drive that conversation in common language across our teams.
Before JC goes into another layer down here, we got another number of great questions, and I actually skipped one from earlier, and this individual sent another one, so I appreciate the bump. First off, at what employee levels of an org should have access to Elate or should have access to this planning framework? We'll get into that here in a moment. Ultimately, we see the most successful organizations, they see this brought to life across all layers of the organization. However, I cannot stress this enough. It is a phased approach. It is building a foundation, starting with the leadership team and ensuring that there is buy-in and that there is an understanding of what is our framework, what is the operating rhythm and cadence, what is the mission, the vision, the values, as well as then the operating metrics themselves that we want to ensure we're communicating to the organization, and how are we building this into our normal rhythm. And once that's done at the leadership level, now we can start to take it to, we'll call it the VP or director level, to managers, to individual contributors, so that everyone is a part of it. However, so many organizations, I think, have had false starts, or they still have scar tissue from trying to roll out like performance management or goal tracking across every part of the organization, and it failed. And the reason it more than likely failed is that there was a lack of a why behind introducing more software into the day-to-day of employees. If we can't answer that question of why are we doing this, what is the value that we're driving at the leadership level and for our employees, the likelihood is it will fail, this framework or any other framework. As we then start to think about the practicality of these, the other question we got from the same individual is, are themes yearly or quarterly? Themes should be set on an annual basis, or if you're a large enough organization that thinks multi-year in your horizons, it could be beyond a year, but typically our best practices, themes are annual. Underneath those, as JC's going to get into, that's where objectives tend to be more quarterly based and how they're set, but they can have annual objectives where you have quarterly, we'll call them pull markers throughout the way, but those tend to be set on more of a quarterly basis.
Mm-hmm.
All right, sorry to jump in there, JC, but a few questions I want to make sure we got to before we kept moving on.
Please keep the questions going. This is what we want to be able to pause and be able to give more clarity to these different layers, especially with what it looks like for your all's organization as well. All right. So let's take it down one more layer. We have those operational metrics. We have the themes now built, and this is where we start to bring those objectives to life and really start to think about tactical execution. So given we had the question about vernacular, here at this layer, again, we call these objectives. These might be referred to as initiatives or goals, but really these are the high-level goals that we want to achieve across our organization. Now, when we think about starting to build objectives, what we tell everyone is we want to make sure we're building these in a way that is really consistent, but also in a way that is connected. So as we start to build these out, our number one piece of feedback is keep them clear and concise. So for this example here of driving indispensability to operations leaders, one of our leadership objectives might be that we want to expand our enterprise market. We say that anyone should be able to look at your objective, and without knowing the context behind everything you're going to go or everything you're going to do to get there, you want to be able to look at it and say, okay, I know what it is that they're trying to tackle. Typically starts with a verb, lets us know the action that we want to take. From there, we create our objective, and the magic happens below as we think about the measurements for how we're going to get there. We see two different types of measurements. On the left-hand side, we refer to these as outcomes. These are the quantitative measurements that we want to achieve to help us understand when we get to the end of the quarter for this specific objective, were we successful or not? What was the goalpost that we are trying to hit? So as I click through here, as we think about expanding our enterprise market, our outcome, our quantitative measurement, the business change that we expect to see if we expand our enterprise market is exceeding $2 million in Q1 within the enterprise market. This is very specific. This is measurable. It helps us understand what we want to do by the end of the quarter. Now, on the flip side of that, we know that there are also some different types of measurements, which we refer to as tactics. We think about tactics as those outputs that are going to directly influence how we get to our outcomes. As we think about tactics, this is not a laundry list of every task that we want to be able to do. These are things that we want visibility to as a leadership team to say, hey, this larger initiative, this larger body of work that we're taking on, oftentimes binary, did we complete it, yes or no? We're measuring the progress 0 to 100. How is that influencing the outcome that we want to achieve? So for this example, we know that in order to expand our enterprise market, we have to develop an entirely new enterprise sales playbook so we can penetrate into that market. Now, the thing that I want to stress about these two different types of measurements here is it is oftentimes one of the most difficult things, especially as we take this down to different layers of the employee levels, to come up with that outcome. Again, natural instinct is we go to the right and we say, here are all the things that we are going to do, how we're going to measure the progress in order to get there. What happens is that starts to give a very false sense of success with our objective. Because we can start to get to the end of the quarter and say, our enterprise sales playbook is going great. We're about to launch it. We are on track with this objective, not knowing that we are not moving the needle at all on the outcome. And oftentimes we find that out at the end of the quarter and it's too late to pivot or try to change any direction of what we're doing. So I say that because these two types of measurements need to be working in tandem. If there is a tactic involved within that objective, we have to understand how that plays into the outcome and what it is that we want to achieve by the end of the quarter to know that we are successful. I'm going to pause there. Brooks, anything you would add to this layer specifically of the framework?
So I think the biggest thing to hone in on is that, as Jacey's alluded to, the outcome orientation versus just purely outputs. We know both are necessitated in delivering on these different objectives that connect into the themes. However, being able to ensure that we're emphasizing here is the outcome that we can ladder all the way back up to the operating metric itself is critical to success. Again, the outputs themselves, we want to be pointing towards that, but we should almost think of outcomes as being able to build upon one another in reaching the overall operating plan or the operating metrics that we're building into the strategy itself. Tying this in, I saw we got two specific questions going back to themes. Is it common to have multiple themes for each operational metric? There doesn't necessarily have to be a correlation to the number of operating metrics as well as the number of themes. Usually we're going to recommend somewhere between, like, let's call it 3 to 5 themes over the course of the year. Any more than that, and it's way too many buckets, more than likely for folks to feel like there's a prioritization that's been applied, or even things that have been said no to during that process. And if we're beyond like 5 to 6 operating metrics within that plan itself, then we probably have more like just BAUs or business as usual metrics that we're monitoring versus guiding our operating plan itself. I think tying into this, the other thing that I'll speak to at the measurement level is we have a question here of how would you describe long-term strategy versus long-term vision? We often run into the mix of the two, and wondering if there's a clear definition for each. And I don't know that I'm going to give you here's a crystal clear answer to delineation of the two. What I would say is that for long-term vision, I'm not sure that that's different than just the vision in and of itself of the organization. I think that's ultimately what we aspire to be within the way that I typically think of it or frame it is 10 years from now. Or if we're thinking well into the future, this is where we are. If we're setting a 10-year strategy or even a strategy that's for the largest of organizations beyond 3 years, the likelihood is we might be setting ourselves up for failure, because if that is our strategy and we're just marching towards that on horizons that are multi-year, we're likely losing the element of dynamism to where we can orient around what's actually happening in the here and now. Even if we look over the course of the last 2 years within the macroeconomic conditions, there's been a lot of strategies that have been absolutely blown up and torn apart based on increased interest rates, based on the changes that are occurring at a global level, where we need to be able to revisit and be dynamic in how our strategy continues to point towards that 10-year vision, but we're orienting in much quicker time frames, quarterly or annually. And so strategy, again, allows us to reach the vision itself. That likely isn't changing. The vision is staying the same. What needs to adjust based on performance, based on what's working, what's not, is the strategy in and of itself that we're building into it. And I think this model is designed to help facilitate that. So, Jacey, I don't know if you'd add anything to either of those questions.
No, spot on. I think those are great. These are awesome questions as we think about, there's a lot around the definitions of these. And I love that that's the direction that we're going as well, because the more clarity, again, we came back to what is the point of all of this, right? Like, why do we have a framework? And to be able to have that consistency, that cohesive language, and also the connection, these things matter as we think about the way that we really roll this out to our team and how the different layers really impact each other as well. All right.
One other question here really quickly, Jacey, for you. Do outcomes need to be drafted to be reviewed on a quarterly basis? Or could we draft outcomes to be checked at the end of the year and we review progress on a quarterly basis? So, and if I'm understanding this correctly, it's basically, should we be every single quarter drafting new outcomes? Or should we set an outcome at an annual basis and then kind of check it along the way, quarter over quarter, for progress? I do think, and Jacey, I'd love your perspective. I do think there's an element of the type of company. If you're a growth stage business designed to be scaling 100% year over year, then the likelihood is that you're setting them at the beginning of the year, but you're probably adjusting accordingly based on the overall performance if you're in that high growth startup scale up type of mentality. If you're more of a Fortune 500, Fortune 100 type of organization where you have board of directors and shareholder calls, things along those lines, the likelihood is you're not going to be adjusting what that operating plan was at the onset. You're more so reporting on the overall performance to plan. I think this is where signaling and being able to clearly communicate in advance what are our expectations and how do we align with those are really important. I would always orient though towards, again, the stage of the company, but being dynamic and changing potentially objectives to accommodate when we need to accelerate certain outcomes. When we see things lagging, what are the intervention points that we have in place to go in and right size those, or to say, hey, we're not driving towards or reaching this outcome. Here are the things that we thought were going to allow us to get there. They're not working. So how do we come together as a leadership team and proactively remove hurdles from our team members or reconstruct objectives based on new information that we have at our disposal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brooks, I think I would just add to that as well. And I think you're saying this exact same thing, but what we want to make sure that we're avoiding, let's say we do have more of these annual objectives or annual outcomes, and oftentimes those might sit at a leadership level as well, again, based upon the stage of your organization. What we don't want to do is set it and forget it. That is the most dangerous thing that we can do with all the change that is happening every day, every quarter. So even if we are setting annual objectives across our organization, making sure we refer to them here as rituals here at Elate, but that operating rhythm, making sure we all have that chance to come back, and maybe that's a quarterly refresh. So the objective is still annual, but coming back together and saying, is this still on track with what we're thinking, what we're seeing in the market, the shifts that are happening? We have a customer that we work with that refers to this as persist or pivot. They do this every quarter. They come back together as the team, so it doesn't feel like we're just rebuilding the plan every single quarter. We're evaluating it. We're saying, how are we doing it? This doesn't mean we're changing every goalpost every quarter, right? But we are having those conversations of, does this still make sense? And if it doesn't, we need to talk about it. We need to make sure we are being dynamic so we can proactively shift and change to make sure we are getting closer to, again, all those metrics that we set in place at the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So going into this conversation, again, one of the other questions we had gotten kind of prompting us for the direction of the discussion is, do you mind sharing more on the purpose of themes? This is a layer we don't have in our company today, and I think it could help us avoid setting so many objectives. And the reason I bring up that question is I just got another one here in the chat of, I'm sorry if you already addressed this, but why is it beneficial to have around 3 to 5 themes instead of more? And to answer both of these in parallel, Jacey, if we move to the next one around, like, what is the purpose of themes? They really should serve as this conduit between the vision and how it comes to life. The way that I've always described this is like you have your electric visionary CEO or leadership team potentially that's casting directionally, where do we need to go in 10 years from now? Like, what is it we want to be doing? They're thinking big picture. They're getting everyone excited about what is it we're collectively building together. However, for strategy and operations leaders, our role so often is taking that energy, taking the electricity itself, and harnessing it into meaningful actions throughout the rest of the organization, right? That conduit, so to speak. And that's where themes really come into play, is they can take all of that energy, all of that momentum, and make it something that is contextualized for our employees. Because for most folks, if we show them 5 to 6 operating metrics and tell them, this is what you should get excited about, this is what your work is going towards, it's going to fall on deaf ears. It's not going to necessarily click with them. They might understand the importance of revenue or customer renewals or gross margin, but it's probably not something that gets them out of bed every single day. And that's what themes are designed for, is they're supposed to kind of serve as the bridge between what is our operating plan, and then how do we ensure that employees are focused on the right objectives or priorities. And they're this layer that allows them to say, okay, as I'm creating these objectives, as I'm creating these initiatives, I can connect my objective to these buckets or to these themes that I know are also tied into the best interests of the organization itself, right? And that's where we start to get into the examples of what are themes. And we'll go through a few of these, but as I'm sharing that, there's just as much importance of saying, these are the 3 to 5 things we will do, as going through the process and saying, well, here were the other themes that we evaluated that we're not going to do, that we will not focus on. If we say we have 7, 9, 10 different themes, there's just about enough themes there to probably justify any initiatives or objectives that employees want to take on. So when we say we want to focus on setting 3 to 5, the reason we do that is so that we don't just have this blanket statement of anything and everything can be worked upon. We want to say, no, these are the specific areas. And so these are some of the examples. The first one I always like to touch on is revenue orientation, because we'll inevitably get asked the question of, okay, if we want to grow where we know, focus on our customer base, do I put a revenue target to that, or do I not put a revenue target to that? I will say that is very much a cultural decision. Internally, we care about transparency a lot, so we put our revenue target to that. However, if you don't want to put a revenue target to, as an example, grow where we know, then let's focus on, well, where do we want to make sure that we're communicating to employees we are growing? In this example, it's growing where we know with our ICP. I would even say, if you wanted to put a definition to what your ideal customer profile is, maybe it's 500 to 5,000 in terms of employee count at organizations, you could do that. But I think it's a cultural decision whether you add a revenue target or not. However, if we're not going to put a revenue target, it's likely warranted to add a little bit of definition of where do we want to grow versus just saying grow. That can be fairly open-ended for folks.
Yeah, as we think about these middle two as well, Brooks, I brought this up as we talked about the framework, is that we'll a lot of times see things in growth or new development, but oftentimes there's maybe a culture one that's in there as well. You can see here an example: create a culture of belonging. So rather than just saying culture or teamwork, making sure we're understanding what it is that we are trying to get at with that. The culture theme can oftentimes be a dangerous one, right? Like I mentioned, because we'll have that there, and then it feels like it's just the responsibility of the HR team or one objective that's holding up the entire success of that theme, which is a lot. So this is an example of how we see some organizations kind of make it like dual purpose, right? So as we think about creating a culture of belonging, not only is that internally, as we think about our new hire process, as we think about our recruiting process and what that looks like, but also how we create this culture of belonging externally as well. So how we work with our customers, our vendors, our partners, understanding how we can have that same message. So now we're bringing other teams into the fold as we think about that cross-functional connection across this theme, like sales being involved, as we think about the enablement of how we work with customers, marketing being involved here as well. So again, making sure we're being very directional as we're using these. Protect the base is another great example. Brooks, I will say in the last 2 years, a theme similar to this is very, very popular among a lot of plans. Obviously, there's a lot happening within the market. We've seen a lot of shifts, and there's been this spotlight on, of course, growth, but even this focus that goes even further into protecting the base and the customers that we have. So understanding how we build for that, how we work with our customers, bringing that all back to retention and the experience that they have, so on and so forth. So protect the base has been one where we have seen a common theme across many over the last year or two.
Yeah, I feel like that's inevitably in every plan, and if it's not, it's even one where we're asking the questions of, hey, is there an emphasis on kind of the install base or customers that you have today? The last one that we use as an example here, because it's one we have internally, is the idea of like making meaningful moments. And for us, one of the reasons I love the idea of themes is it also helps set potentially a cultural tone without having necessarily a culture or people only type of theme. For us, it's this idea that we want to create meaningful moments in how anyone ever interacts with us, whether it was at Blueprint, and the example I used is like individuals working at our swag shop that were handing out different t-shirts, or we had mini soccer balls, things like that. Is like, we just want people to have a meaningful moment when they interact with Elate. If it's taking a demo with our sales team, if it's how we respond to someone that's got a bug that they find within the platform. It's the idea that, again, we're coming back to, this is how we want to orient the way that we approach anyone that comes in contact with Elate. And so there can be specific objectives or initiatives that drive towards making meaningful moments, but it also helps me in communicating at town halls on a monthly basis or quarterly kickoffs, this sentiment of, we want this to be at the forefront of culturally how we carry ourselves day in and day out. And so again, it's that idea that we're harnessing kind of the electricity, what we want to be building, and the long-term vision of the organization, and bringing it into something that employees can grab onto, that they can rally around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know we're talking a lot about themes here. I also mentioned that they are definitely my favorite. Brooks, we got one question that says, great, these are awesome. They make sense, but how do we make sure they make sense to employees beyond just the strategy team as we think about the meeting? And I think that's where we were starting to go, is you're thinking about how you bring them to life in town halls and different pieces like that. But would love to open up to what are those best practices for implementing them beyond just the strategy team? Because I agree, makes sense in the room of individuals that are putting them together. But how do we make sure that they make sense for everyone else as we are using these to create that electricity throughout the year as well?
Yeah. And again, we touched on this. I almost held off on the question to align it with this part of the presentation, but it's the idea of not overdoing it, being able to be focused and intentional on prioritizing what we should versus should not do. I think with this idea of not overdoing it, we did have a question way back, and I appreciate our head of marketing floating this one back to me, is, even within organizations, there's potentially ways that we want themes to span across different intents. So we have an organization that, per this question, has a professional services division versus a traditional like software as a service orientation. And the way that those two parts of the organization think and operate might be quite a bit different. But I think that idea of themes and helping to bridge the gap between two different divisions and operating metrics themselves, but more so instill a cultural dynamic within how we want to think about approaching our work on a day in and day out basis, does bring us closer to this. I would say the other thing in that type of an example is that professional services versus a software as a service business, they might have different ICPs. They might have different customer install bases that they serve. So that's where, even in a revenue-oriented theme itself, it could be specific in outlining, hey, here is recurring revenue as a target versus one-time services as a target, to make sure that we're bringing those both together.
Yeah, Brooks, I like the piece on the prioritizing the should nots as well. I think that is always one of my favorite parts of an offsite, and ones that we've been able to see or be a part of, is having that activity where people have like, hey, here's everything we think the theme should be, and actually getting really intentional and saying, everyone cross off all of them but one, right? What is the top non-negotiable? And it is one of the hardest activities for people to do because everything feels so important. And by crossing them off or saying that this is a should not or have not, I think it's very important to know that that doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means that that is not the most important one as we think about this year and what we're focusing on and what we want to do. So while we're going through those activities to create those 3 to 5, when we get out of that as well, as Brooks mentioned, make sure we're messaging that to the rest of our team, those that were not in the room, understanding, hey, here are the things that were really important, but there are the should nots right now. So everyone has full clarity of that as we're moving forward. The second piece of that is to strike a balance. Again, this is a harder thing to do as we think about starting to build those themes. We'll see a lot of themes that are one word and it just says like grow or build, which are fine, right? We understand a little bit about where we're going, but when someone looks at that, you can make an argument for every single objective to go into the grow category because it's not clear and directional of how we are going to get there. So striking that balance, making sure that employees understand it, but also making sure we're not going so far to the other end of the spectrum that we are now so overly prescriptive that in different departments, to similar to the question that was just asked, they can no longer resonate to it. It doesn't make sense to them in the work that they are doing. So like everything we have in life, striking that balance, coming to that divine middle of making sure it's clear and concise and multiple people can all rally around why we're doing it and why it matters.
Yeah, sometimes we'll see like the actual theme and the purpose statement and the project plan and all of this tied into the definition of it. And I think a lot of times that not only is overkill, but it's going to frankly like feel as though folks can't touch that theme because it's almost too prescriptive. And They're like, I'm not sure where I fit into it. And so finally, we have this idea of themes as a living concept, reinforcing these throughout the year as a reminder, because this is how we want folks to go about their day in and day out, to be able to look at themes that have been set by the leadership team and leverage those as a way to prioritize their own work. I said the idea of clarity, it's the enablement or empowerment of employees to go make decisions without having to check in with managers for every single thing that they're doing, and then having managers go upstream to evaluate every single decision that's made. But instead, if we can build this framework in a way where now everyone understands where we want to go and how we get there, it also allows them to, frankly, prioritize their own work, and even empowers them in certain instances, say no to the things that aren't worth them spending their time and energies on. We see so many organizations right now dealing with priority fatigue, where employees feel as though everything is a priority. They're trying to look at my work through the lens that the organization has set as priorities. Okay, so we've got a few more questions here that I certainly want to get to. With the last few minutes that we have remaining, one thing I do also want to touch on is we had a few questions sent in advance. So I'm going to ask those really quickly, and then I'm going to shift into some of the questions I just saw come through the live channel. The first of which, we've kind of touched on this, and operating metrics ultimately tie back to your operating plan. These are the 5 to 6 metrics that we're building into our plan, that we're reporting on to our board of directors, that ultimately dictate, was this year a success or not? There might be more than 5 to 6 metrics you report to your board on. There likely is more than 5 or 6. However, we want to make sure that we're not just building out dashboards with hundreds of different scorecards or KPIs tracking everything. The first of which is, can you take a moment to discuss how this planning then trickles down to the divisional objectives? Do you think of divisional objectives just as the team responsible for achieving each objective under the themes? What about divisional objectives that might not directly link to a corporate objective? So this is where we get back to that phased approach. We want to do this first and foremost at the leadership level, where we're agreeing on the operating metrics, the themes themselves, and setting, frankly, the ELT, and likely, let's call it, if we got our L1s, leadership 1 level, which is exec, L2s, we need to make sure there's buy-in established, and that they're clearly communicated to those different division leaders, department leaders, et cetera. What we see the best plans then do is that they've set, here's what our plan is for the year. Now let's go validate. Let's take this downstream. And this isn't necessarily a democracy where we need every individual contributor, every employee voting on, is this a good strategy or plan? But we wanted them to have input and saying, hey, here's what we want to achieve as an organization this year. Let's give you some ownership in setting objectives, setting your own initiatives, whether they're outcome oriented or output driven, so tactics versus outcomes, but that do connect in to the overall strategy itself, that do connect into those themes that we're setting at an organizational level. Again, that will not happen overnight. We have to spend the time and the energy setting that foundation at leadership, communicating the why, to then start to take that to the rest of our organization. We can't start at a bottoms up approach and go to them without first setting that cadence and structure at a leadership level. One other one I know, and Jacey, I'll let you kind of touch on this one. Do you have a strategic planning playbook? I'm in a new organization and would love to apply best practices on how we facilitate this throughout the org. So I know You do, but go ahead.
Absolutely, we do. And these are some resources we can share out after. We have an entire kind of operating cadence playbook as well for how we can start to bring that to life, but also a lot of different resources as you guys are stepping into your offsites for how to start to facilitate some of these sessions as well. I saw someone just ask, have you found a good way to arrive at themes and quarterly objectives? Any ideas beyond like SWOT analysis, pieces like that? We have different things as well that we can certainly share with you that help make sure we're hearing from everyone in those different activities as well, but also different worksheets and things like that that will bring consistency and the common language to those as well as we're starting to build out those different pieces of the plan. So the short answer is yes. We have a lot of different pieces, and we'd certainly love to chat with you as well for what planning looks like for you all as you're stepping into that, so that we can be as helpful and supportive as possible in that.
Okay. I think the last one that I want to touch on here, and then we can wrap it up and talk through the next parts of this upcoming series. Our organization has a pretty solid idea of our framework, and it goes well in planning, but it seems to stall out after, and we don't pick it back up until we're ready to do it again. How have you seen organizations keep this alive? And this is like where at the onset we talked about that idea of an operating rhythm, and those rituals is what we refer to them as, but think of it as your operating cadence. That is a non-negotiable. I think most organizations do strategic planning. Whether they do it well or not is to be argued, but almost all of them will go through it because they know they have to. They have to be able to present something to the board itself. That being said, how we carry that through in the review process, how we report on it, how we proactively drive conversations in a way that removes hurdle from employees or doubles down on what's working, it comes through the idea of how we build in an operating cadence and rhythm. For what we recommend, often we see this done at a bi-weekly basis for organizations. Some might do it weekly, others monthly. I think a lot of it comes down to combination of culture as well as how many folks are we trying to get into the room and time zones and size of the organization. But if we don't have a pre-agreed upon structure of here's when we'll meet, here's how we're going to almost circulate as a pre-read all the information to be discussed and the topics, and then spend the time actually removing hurdles and having a bias to action versus just pure roll call of here's the objective and the overall status, and that's all we're there for. If we don't have that before we move into the new year, trying to introduce that once we've already got a strategy in flight, once everyone already has their priorities and objectives for the year, is so difficult, almost impossible, which is why it's so critical now to be getting those to be getting that buy-in, to be building those mutual agreements ahead of the structure itself. So I don't know if JC, you'd add anything to that, but that was kind of the final question here we had today.
Yeah, that's the continued theme around clarity, but also just to reiterate the point, gain agreements early, gain them now, so that when you step into the new year, we're ready to go, and we have that rhythm in place with our team that we can come back to time and time again.
Okay. So as promised, we kept this to an hour right on the dot. We're 1 p.m. Eastern here, but what we wanted to do to close things out is, well, first off, thank everyone for taking the time to be a part of this Q&A with JC and myself. This is what we love. We absolutely cannot tell you how much we enjoy the opportunity to bring together strategy and operations leaders from industries, from across different parts of the globe, and to have these types of sessions. And we want to keep this going. So today we have this strategic planning framework best practices. We will be putting in place 3 additional sessions, the first of which is measuring business impact versus activity. So we started to touch on this today, the idea of measuring outcomes versus outputs. That is a session where, if that is a challenge for you as an organization today, figuring out how are these outcomes being built into our strategic planning framework, you will not want to miss that session. And October 15th, we're going to double down on how does the Elate platform itself help to facilitate this, specifically by highlighting a new feature that we have rolling out called Insights. So for existing customers, this will be a sneak peek into something we have coming up here in the coming months. For those that aren't familiar with Elate, hopefully this is a valuable way to get introduced to the platform itself. And then finally, we'll wrap up on October 22nd with a customer spotlight. One topic we see so often and hear about is how do we maximize those leadership meetings? Frankly, they're the most expensive meetings we have as an organization. So how do we optimize those? And we're going to have Lou Desiderio, COO from Form Assembly, sharing a bit about their structure and how they've seen the evolution of their leadership meetings at Form Assembly over the last couple of years. So if there's interest in joining any of those, but in particular, session number 2 that we have coming up here in 9 days, our head of marketing, Tim, just dropped in the chat a link for folks to subscribe to those events or to reference the last thing, a blog post that we've done to kind of bring to life a lot of the discussion we just had today around themes and strategic planning framework. So again, thank you all for taking the time here to join Jacey and myself. We truly appreciate it and look forward to continuing the conversations.